half kneeling glute activation. So we like to use that half kneeling position so we can use that front leg as it comes up into hip flexion to kind of lock up our lumbar motion so we're not compensating through our low back. And then also that back leg, as my knee's bent, I'm putting a little bit more load through my rectus femoris. So when I do that glute set, I can feel a little bit more of a stretch on the front of the hip. So oftentimes we'll use this instead of like a hip flexor mobilization or like a knee to wall hip flexor mobilization. This is where we'll start because a lot of people will really arch their back and it creates a compensation, so not getting any sort of loading of the tissue on the front side of the hip. So then sometimes like in that actual true half kneeling position where I'm flat over ground, like so, this is actually a little bit too aggressive for people. So I like to set them up to where their knee is directly under their hip, and then the front ankle or my right ankle is kind of under my knee, and then hands on hips. So if I put my hands on my hip bones, it kind of creates like a bowl, and I'm trying to tuck my hips back under me. When I do that, I'm squeezing my left glute, and I'll immediately feel a pull through the front of this left hip. So if I go to the right side for the video purpose here, and I again kind of really arch my back to get a feel for that, and then tuck my hips under, I feel a pull immediately across the front of this right hip. Now, ways that I can modify this is I can simply scoot myself back a little bit so then my knee comes in front of my body, and when I do the glute set, I don't feel nearly as much of a stretch across the front of the hip. Or I can slightly bring my knee under me a little bit more or come behind me and then do a glute set, and that's going to increase the stretch. And then I can take away a little bit of a stretch by elevating myself and then kind of pointing my toe. So when I point my toe, that takes me out of knee flexion. I know it's pretty minimal, but when you do the glute set in this position, you don't feel nearly as much of a stretch entirely across the front of the hip. And again, this is kind of a drill that we use to be able to feel your glutes fire and the initiation of being able to kind of mobilize or stretch out some of the tissues on the front side of the hip. So it's more of a feel type drill than it really is any sort of like structural adaptation type thing. So play with those positions to where your knee is relative to your hip, and those types of those modifications and setups if you need to kind of come forward versus getting back. And then again, how wide your stance is, left versus right, that'll give you some stability input. So play with your setup. Again, point of emphasis is to be able to feel your glutes firing and feeling somewhat of a stretch across the front of the hip without overarching your low back.